Hey, shalom, 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 lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hi, Rob Tawab La Atham, Za'achikam Yawaman or Chagador Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte, Nachamatam Kaya, Hamalakata Shamayim Kwara, repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, call Halayim La La, but now Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai Bahasham, Rachak Wadash, Wamashana, Lazar Qaim Nawa, Wamal Akim Shar Chagador, to our praises too. Our Father Yahweh, which means he exists, Bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai delivers, and double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is the term supersessionism, and it reads, it says, supersessionism, also called fulfillment theology, by its proponents, and replacement theology, by its detractors, is the so-called Christian doctrine that the so-called Christian church has superseded the Jewish people, assuming their role as the Most High's covenanted people, thus asserting that the new covenant through Yahweh Shai has superseded or replaced the Mosaic covenant. Supersessionists hold that the universal church has become the Most High's new Israel, and thus so-called Christians are the people of the Most High and not the Jews. In which, this is ultimately a worldly term. All right, this ultimately has derived from different sects such as what they call I believe it's pretty much going into the denomination, so-called denomination of being Protestant. All right, in which that came a lot of that pretty much was after the time of when the printing press was created. All right, but going into the scriptures, this is not scriptural. All right, and I just want to get a couple precepts illustrating that point. So we'll start with Romans chapter 9, and we'll get verse 1. And it says, I say the truth in Hamashayach, I lie not. My conscience also bearing me witness in the Holy Spirit. All right. And a lot of times, so-called Christians ultimately like to delve into the writings of Paul, in which, Paul was a man of the Lord. He's a member of the elect. And ultimately, as he mentions in Romans, the 11th chapter, he's an Israelite, because ultimately the Lord, Yahweh Shai HaMashiach, is coming back to deliver the elect of the nation of Israel. All right, in which Israel ultimately goes into the people. All right, in which the people ultimately consist of you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, West Indians, Haitians, and Israelite foreigners. Continuing on to verse 2, it says that I have great heaviness and continual sorrow in my heart, for I could wish that myself were accursed from Hamashayach, from my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh. All right, because ultimately, when we go into the lineage of Yashar Allah, all right, you have, Israelite foreigners, all right, but ultimately, the Israelite foreigners, derive from a specific lineage, all right, and in the flesh, all right, and through the specific bloodline, all right, goes back to, the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right, verse 4 says, who are Israelites, all right, because that's who the Lord is coming back for. It says, to whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of the Most High and the promises. All right, so everything, all right, the scriptures, when you read a book, all right, as brothers or elder brothers, the apostles, elder brothers, and brothers go into, when you read a book, ultimately you don't have to read through the book and then flip back to the title page to see who the book is about. All right, it's already understood. What's understood don't have to be explained, because the book is ultimately to Yashar Allah. All right, it doesn't have to be said that, hey, it's for Yashar Allah. All right, and also going into that, the scriptures is codified. All right, and the elect have the codes. All right, but continuing on, reading verse 4 again, it says, who are Israelites, to whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of the Most High and the promises. All right, so when you go into so-called religion, all right, supersessionism, all right, replacement theology, all right, Protestantism, all right, none of that is of doctrine. All right, none of that is scriptural. All right, because ultimately, those that have the service of the Lord, those that retain the promises, those that are given the law, are the elect of the nation of Yashar Allah. All right, and ultimately, 2/3 will have the law, statutes, and commandments written in their inward parts. All right, in the kingdom. All right, but first and foremost on this side, the Lord is coming back to deliver the elect of the nation of Israel. All right, so continuing on to verse 5, it says, whose are the fathers and of whom, as concerning the flesh, Hamashayach came, who is over all, the Most High blessed forever. Amen. So when we go into this right here, it says supersessionism, also called replacement theology by its proponents, and also called fulfillment theology by its proponents, and replacement theology by its detractors, is the so-called Christian doctrine that the so-called Christian church has superseded the Jewish people, assuming their role as the Most High's covenanted people. I mean, we ultimately got that, the Lord has a covenant, all right, with the Israelites. So it says, thus asserting that the new covenant through Yahweh Shai HaMashiach has superseded or replaced the Mosaic covenant. Supersessionists hold that the universal church has become the Most High's new Israel, in which, you can't find that, all right, in the scriptures. All right, it's nowhere that says, all right, something superseded or replaced, all right, what was written, all right, in the Old Testament, because when they refer to the Mosaic covenant, ultimately they're talking about what was written in the Old Testament, all right, but it's nothing that says that, hey, so-called Christians, or it's nothing about supersessionism in the scriptures, all right, because the scriptures say that. I'm gonna get this real fast. This is Romans chapter 11, and we'll get verse 2. Verse 1, it says, I say then, hath the Most High cast away his people? The Most High forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. And ultimately, this is imperative, you see, because again, so-called Christians like to bring out the fact that Paul was sent to the Gentiles. All right, but when you go into who the Gentiles are in the New Testament, ultimately you have to understand, you have to have the understanding of the history to understand the mystery, you see, because who are the Gentiles? All right. But continuing on, I'm reading again. It says, Romans 11 verse 1, it says, I say then, hath the Most High cast away his people? The Most High forbid. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. All right. So ultimately, again, the Lord never did away, with his people. Ultimately, we went off. All right, we went into captivity. All right, and the Lord ultimately is returning his truth into the earth. All right, and then following that is going to be the deliverance, all right, and the salvation of the elect of the nation of Yahshua Allah. All right, but the Lord has never dealt with the heathen. All right, because you got two types of Gentiles. You got the actual Gentiles; those are ultimately of the other nations, and then you got those that are born into the customs and the traditions and the ways of the heathen. All right, hence the similitude that we got in the Israelite foreigners in the ancient world. All right, and then us in America, Babylon the Great. All right, and the various different captivities that Jake has been scattered to. You see, because we came up in the ways and the rudiments of this world, and in the ways of pretty much captivity. All right, and that's likened unto what the Israelite foreigners experience. All right, in the ancient world. All right, but pretty much going back into the point, the Lord never did away with his people. All right, so let's get a few more, because the Lord pretty much scattered us. All right, let's get that. This is Dabar Yam, Deuteronomy chapter 28, and we'll get verse 64. And it says, I'm going to start at verse 15. All right, and it reads, in the subtitle, in the blue letter, it says, consequences of disobedience. All right, because when we go back up to verse 1, it says, and it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy power, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy power will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. All right. It says, verse 2, and all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy power. All right, in which on this side, we wasn't made to get it perfectly, so ultimately, the curses, we pretty much succumb to the curses. All right, but the fulfillment of Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter, all right, Deuteronomy 28 and verse 1 and 2 is going to be in the kingdom. All right, that's where we're going to hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord. All right, we're going to observe to do the commandments which are in the scriptures, and we're going to get the blessings. All right, but skipping down to verse 15, because we didn't fully, subscribe to the law, statutes, and commandments, so the curses was placed upon us. All right, verse 15, it says, consequences of disobedience. It says, but it shall come to pass if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy power to observe to do all his commandments, to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee, in which that's ultimately what happened. All right, but skipping down to verse 64, because this is going into a specific curse. All right, verse 64, it reads, and the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone, which that wood ultimately goes into so-called Christianity, all right, which it has various different facets, all right, and then that stone ultimately goes into, the Islam, all right, but I want to get this term for scatter. And it says pawatazad, and it says be dispersed. All right, it says to be scattered, to spread abroad. It says especially to disperse. All right, and when you go into this word for disperse, it ultimately goes into diaspora or diaspora, and it's ultimately what happened unto us, all right, as a people. All right, because when you look in the spirit, you see Jake scattered across the four corners of the globe. All right, no matter what Jake looks like. All right, hence, scriptures like Romans, the 8th chapter and the 16th verse. All right, this is Romans chapter 8 and verse 16. It says the spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit. All right, what is the spirit? John 6 and 63. It is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life, roughly paraphrasing. So the spirit is talking about the scriptures. All right, so the scriptures is a living testament. It's living proof. It's living evidence. All right, and it resonates with our spirit, you see, because what is in the scriptures ultimately it's a detailed synopsis as to what happened to us as a people. All right, even though it doesn't have, what we're called present day necessarily. All right, it tells and it's codified to where the elect ultimately understand. You see, and that's why it ultimately serves as living proof. It's the black and white. All right, so in the courtroom, all right. Going into Isaiah the 59th chapter, just a little side tangent. All right, scriptures say that, the Lord saw it and it displeased him that there was no judgment. You see, because ultimately, in this land, all right, we're called pretty much, we're not called the people of the Lord. All right, but that's not a righteous testament. All right, you see, because over time, all right, our names have been changed. All right, but the black and white is the scriptures. All right, it's the evidence. All right, ultimately, again, going into Romans, the 8th chapter and the 16th verse, you see, because what we are called biblically, all right, ultimately is that evidence that ultimately resonates with our spirit, all right, and shows that we're the children of the Lord. All right, so finishing out Romans 8 and 16, it says the spirit itself bear the witness with our spirit that we are the children of the Most High. So again, all right, it's the scriptures is that black and white. It's that court docket. All right, you see, because in Esau's world, all right, we're not called the people of the Lord. You see, but this is a righteous court proceeding. All right, and ultimately, we have that living testament, that living evidence that hey, we're the children of the Lord, and we believe that in faith. All right, because the scriptures itself says it. All right, so continuing on, let's also get Matthew chapter 10 and verse 5, you see, because there's two types of Gentiles. You got the actual heathen Gentiles, but then you have those that are ultimately take on the ways of the Gentiles. This is Matthew chapter 10 and verse 5, and it says, these 12 Yahushai sent forth and commanded them, saying, go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not. Because again, you got actual Gentiles. All right, let's get this word for Gentiles. And it says a tribe, a nation. It says in the Old Testament, foreign nations not worshiping the true power, pagans, Gentiles. All right, and then you have those that ultimately are the Israelite foreigners. But it says these 12 Yahushai sent forth and commanded them, saying, go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as ye go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. All right. And ultimately, you have those of the nation of Yasha'Allah, all right, and be that are ultimately considered lost, you see, because they're following after the rudiments of the Gentiles, all right. But ultimately, it's this word that brings us essentially back home, all right, in which, the elect ultimately are going to subscribe to this word, are going to subscribe to the true healing, all right, with 2/3 of it. They're not going to subscribe to this doctrine, all right. But let's also let's get we'll get Acts chapter 2, and we'll get verse 5. And it says, there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. All right, let's get this in the NLT. And it says, at that time, there were devout Jews from every nation living in Jerusalem. All right, and which is word devout. All right, this word devout, it goes into, it says, taking hold well, carefully and surely, cautiously. It says, reverencing the Most High, pious, religious. All right, and ultimately we understand that the heathen don't have the spirit. They don't have a spirit in them to ultimately, fear the Lord. So we understand that, these are Jakes. All right. So let's also get we'll get this. This is give me a second. Let's get Habakkuk. That's a lot. Let me get this. This is Revelation chapter 7 and verse 9. And it says, after this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands. All right. I'm gonna get this word for kindreds. All right, it says kindreds. This is a tribe in the New Testament, all the persons descending from one of the 12 sons of the patriarch Jacob. All right, so it shows that it says an offshoot. All right, to be an offshoot, it says race or clan. So it's showing that ultimately, it has to be of one lineage. All right. It says Mata, it says staff, branch, tribe. It says company led by chief with staff. All right, it says a branch, a twig, from the idea of stretching out. So in order to stretch out, in order to be a branch, it has to come from the same root. It has to come from the same lineage. All right, that's why it says a tribe, branch of people. So it has to come from. It says only used of the tribes of Israel. All right, so this was synonymous with that word that we got. All right, in the New Testament, going into the word for kindred. All right, because ultimately, the 12 tribes of the nation of Yasha'Allah have been scattered abroad. That's why it says right here, James chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, James, a servant of the Most High and of the Lord Yahweh Shai HaMashiach, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. All right, the 12 tribes are ultimately scattered. I'm going to get this word for abroad. And it says diaspora. It says a scattering, dispersion of Israelites dispersed among foreign nations, the Gentiles. It says of the Christians scattered abroad among the Gentiles. All right. And it says, I'm gonna get this, and I'm gonna go ahead and close. But this is Habakkuk chapter 2, and we'll get verse 5. And it says, Habakkuk 1 and 5. It says, behold, yea, among the heathen. All right, yea, among the heathen, talking about the Israelite foreigners. It says, in regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told to you. You see, because ultimately, when you look at the mindset of those that was in the ancient world, all right, those that was keeping the law, statutes, and commandments, they felt as if, the understanding, was that those that was keeping the customs, they felt like, well, they outcasted those that was the Israelite foreigners. All right, and the Israelite foreigners, they ultimately, again, they was outcasted. So that's why it says, "Behold, ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which ye will not believe, though it be told to you." See, because the Israelite foreigners was outcasted. So it seemed as if they wasn't going to be able to be placed into the promises, all right, and so on and so forth, all right. But ultimately, being that they come from that same tribe, that same branch, that same seed line, the Israelite foreigners are able to be grafted back in, because ultimately they come from the same lineage, the same genus, the same plant, all right. Because the Lord ultimately is coming back to deliver the elect of the nation of Yasharallah, all right, from a specific lineage. There is no such thing as spiritual Israel or replacement theology, Protestantism, so on and so forth, right? The Lord only deals with an elect, all right? And let's get that closed, but this is Romans chapter 11, and we'll go to verse 5, verse 4. Slop. It says, verse 3, it says, "Lord, they have killed thy prophets and dig down thine altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life." It says, "But what saith the answer of the Most High unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Even so, then at this present time also there is a remnant according to the election of grace." So the Lord ultimately is dealing with an elect from the nation of Israel, because you have those that are of Israel, all right, and those that are of the Israel of the Most High, all right. Give me a second. I'm going to read verse 11. It says, "I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? The Most High forbid, but rather through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy." All right, and ultimately, salvation was allotted, to the Israelite foreigners. All right, you see, but it ultimately started, all right, with the southern kingdom, all right, in which they had to be provoked to jealousy, all right, in which that ultimately went into how that played a part in that work being worked in those days that they wouldn't believe, you see, because ultimately, the Israelite foreigners was outcasted. All right, but it's a scripture that goes into let me see. It's a scripture that goes into they are not all of Israel, which are of Israel, because you got the 2/3, all right, and then you got the elect, and the Lord is ultimately dealing with the elect of the nation of Yasharallah, and the elect ultimately are going to comprise of you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, West Indians, Haitians, and Israelite foreigners. So just wanted to go into that. I don't want to Zaza Banaya Paulo was with us, a beautiful edification through the spirit. Water on Tazah, Dam Yashlay Lata Wablu as well. You have a good night. Washalam Lakam, which is peace to you all. Shalom, shalom.